On Christmas Eve, a mail-order bride arrived in rags. The billionaire saw her worth and chose her. On the coldest night of the year, a woman in torn clothes shows up at a massive mansion, holding nothing but hope, and a letter saying she's a mail-order bride. But the man who answers the door isn't the poor ranch hand she expected. He's a billionaire who doesn't believe in love, kindness, or even Christmas. And when he realizes she was sent to him by mistake, everything should have ended right there. But it doesn't. Because the moment he sees the fire in her eyes and the quiet strength she tries to hide, something inside him shifts. But just as she starts to feel safe, someone else shows up claiming she belongs to him. And with a single slip, the whole world turns against her, twisting her into a villain she never wanted to be. Now her heart, her future, and the billionaire's entire legacy hang in the balance. So when a woman meant for someone else changes a powerful man's life forever, who will she choose when love, fate, and the truth finally collide? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The bitter December wind whipped across Clara Monroe's face as she stepped off the church shuttle, clutching her thin jacket closer. Her small duffel bag, containing everything she owned in the world, felt heavy after days of travel. The impressive gates of Thorne Innovations loomed before her, their polished metal gleaming despite the grey afternoon sky. Clara's worn boots crunched in the fresh snow as she made her way to the intercom. Snowflakes caught in her dark curls, and her fingers trembled from more than just the cold as she pressed the button. This was it, the moment she'd been working toward for months. "Hello." Her voice came out softer than intended, wavering slightly. "I'm Clara Monroe. I'm here to meet Ben Thorne. She swallowed hard. "I'm the mail-order bride." There was a long pause, and Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The storm was picking up, fat snowflakes swirling more intensely around her. She shifted from foot to foot, trying to keep warm in her threadbare clothes. The gate buzzed and slowly swung open. Clara hurried through, her legs weak from exhaustion and hunger after the long journey. The path led to a modern building that seemed to touch the clouds, all glass and gleaming steel. As she approached the entrance, the door opened. The man who emerged was not what she expected. Instead of a humble ranch hand, she found herself face to face with someone whose picture she'd seen in business magazines. Roman Thorne himself, the billionaire CEO of Thorne Innovations. He stood in an impeccably tailored suit, his dark eyes narrowed as he studied her. "You must be lost," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "This is a private residence." Clara's stomach dropped. "No, sir, I'm Clara Monroe. I'm supposed to meet Ben Thorne. We've been corresponding for months about—" Her voice trailed off as another gust of wind cut through her thin clothes. Roman's expression remained skeptical, but something flickered in his eyes as he noticed her violent shivering. Clara felt the world tilt slightly, exhaustion and hunger taking their toll. She reached out to steady herself against the doorframe. "You'd better come inside," Roman said, though his tone suggested he wasn't happy about it. "Before you collapse in my doorway." Clara followed him into what appeared to be a penthouse apartment, though apartment seemed too modest a word for the vast space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, now partially obscured by the swirling snow. The interior was minimalist and stark, all clean lines and neutral colors, with none of the warmth she'd imagined in her correspondence with Ben. "Sit," Roman commanded, gesturing to a modern leather chair near a sleek gas fireplace. Clara sank into it gratefully, placing her worn duffel bag carefully beside her. The fire's warmth began to seep into her cold bones, but it did little to ease her growing anxiety. Roman pulled out his phone, his movements precise and efficient. "Margaret, yes, I need you to look into something immediately. There's a woman here claiming to be a mail-order bride for Ben Thorne." He turned away slightly, lowering his voice. "No, I'm not joking. Find out what this is about." Clara sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The penthouse was eerily quiet except for the soft hum of hidden ventilation and the occasional crack from the fireplace. Everything around her spoke of wealth and precision, from the abstract art on the walls to the sophisticated lighting system that adjusted automatically to the darkening sky outside. She thought about the warm, friendly letters she'd exchanged with Ben, full of hope and plans for the future. Nothing about this cold, sterile environment matched the cozy ranch life he'd described. Something had gone very wrong, but she was too exhausted and overwhelmed to figure out what. Roman paced as he waited for his assistant to call back, his expensive shoes silent on the polished floor. He kept casting glances at Clara as if she might suddenly reveal herself to be a threat. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker. His perfectly pressed suit against her travel-worn clothes, his confident stance against her uncertain posture. The storm outside intensified, snow now falling in thick curtains past the windows. Clara watched it with growing unease, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But there was no going back. She'd spent every penny she had getting here, and her tiny apartment back home was already rented to someone else. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions. Clara could feel Roman's suspicion like a physical weight, but she held herself with quiet dignity. Despite her circumstances, she'd faced harder situations in her life, though at the moment she was hard-pressed to remember them. This wasn't at all how she'd imagined her arrival, but then again, nothing in her life had ever gone exactly as planned. She watched the flames dance in the fireplace and waited, hoping that somewhere in this cold, beautiful place there was an explanation that would make everything make sense. The phone in Roman's hand buzzed, and Clara held her breath, knowing that whatever came next would determine her fate. She'd traveled so far, leaving behind everything she knew, all on the promise of a new life. Now she sat in a stranger's home, unwelcome and uncertain, while the winter storm raged outside and her future hung by a thread. As Clara's trembling fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic mug Maribel had pressed into her hands, she breathed in the soothing aroma of chamomile tea. The elegant administrative assistant had appeared moments ago, sweeping into the room with an air of quiet efficiency that made Clara feel slightly less out of place in the pristine penthouse. "Now then," Maribel said, settling onto the edge of a sleek leather chair with a tablet in hand. Her dark eyes were kind but professional as she began tapping through screens of information. "Let's figure out exactly what happened here." Roman stood near the windows, his tall frame silhouetted against the worsening storm outside. Though he'd stepped back to let Maribel handle the situation, his presence remained commanding, filling the space with unspoken tension. "Here we are," Maribel murmured, her brow furrowing as she read. "Oh dear, it seems there's been quite the mix-up." She looked up at Clara with sympathy. "You were meant to meet Benjamin Thorne. He's a distant cousin of Mr. Roman Thorne here. Ben works as a ranch hand at the Golden Creek Ranch about 40 miles outside the city." Clara's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she stared down into her tea. I don't understand. The address I was given—" "It appears the Heritage Matchmaking Agency made a clerical error," Maribel explained, continuing to scroll through the documentation. "When they saw the name Thorne, they automatically entered our corporate headquarters address instead of the ranch address." She glanced at Roman apologetically. "The correspondence shows Ben has indeed been writing to Miss Monroe for several months, but the final travel arrangements were sent with incorrect information. Clara wanted to sink into the floor. Here she was, imposing on one of the wealthiest men in the country because of a simple computer error. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea." Roman's jaw tightened as he turned from the window. "We need to contact security." "Sir." Maribel interrupted smoothly, gesturing to the windows where the snow was now falling so heavily it obscured the view of the city. "The Weather Service just issued a severe storm warning. They're closing the major roads. It wouldn't be safe to send anyone out in these conditions." Clara's heart pounded as she watched Roman process this information. His face remained impassive, but she could see the subtle signs of his frustration, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his fingers flexed at his sides. "She can't stay here," he said firmly. "Where else would you suggest she go?" Maribel asked, her tone gentle but pointed. "The hotels are likely full with stranded travelers, and the temperature is dropping rapidly." She stood up, straightening her blazer with practiced precision. "The East Wing guest room is already prepared. It would be no trouble to let Miss Monroe stay there until morning when the road's clear." Roman paced a few steps, his expensive shoes silent on the polished floor. Clara held her breath, acutely aware that she was at the mercy of this man's decision. Finally, he stopped and gave a sharp nod. "Fine. One night, but I want her gone first thing in the morning." "Of course, sir." Maribel agreed smoothly. She turned to Clara with a warm smile. "Come with me, dear. Let's get you settled." Clara rose shakily, gathering her small duffel bag. "Thank you," she said softly, glancing between Roman and Maribel. "I truly appreciate your kindness." Roman didn't respond, already turning back to the window. Maribel guided Clara through the penthouse, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The hallways were like an art gallery, pristine white walls decorated with carefully chosen pieces, soft lighting highlighting their path. "Don't mind Mr. Thorne," Maribel said quietly as they walked. "He's not comfortable with unexpected changes to his routine, but he's not unkind." Clara nodded, though her throat felt too tight to respond. The events of the day felt surreal. How had she ended up here, in this palace in the sky, when she should be meeting her future husband at a humble ranch? The guest room, when Maribel opened the door, was larger than Clara's entire former apartment. A king-sized bed dominated the space, its crisp white linens looking almost too perfect to touch. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered another stunning view of the city, though now mostly obscured by the swirling snow. "The bathroom is through there." Maribel indicated a door to the left. "You'll find everything you need. Fresh towels, toiletries. If you're hungry, I can have something sent up from the kitchen." "No, thank you," Clara replied, though her stomach was empty. She felt too overwhelmed to eat. "I think I just need to rest." "Of course." Maribel patted her shoulder sympathetically. "Try to get some sleep. Things often look clearer in the morning." After Maribel left, Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, asking for strength and guidance. Everything she'd planned, everything she'd hoped for, had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours. Meanwhile, in the main living area, Roman stood alone at the window. The storm had transformed the city into a swirling white void, the usual glittering lights of buildings and streets now muted and strange. He watched as the snow continued to fall, thinking about the woman now staying in his guest room. There was something about her that unsettled him, not because she seemed threatening, but because of the quiet dignity she maintained even in such a humiliating situation. It made him uncomfortable in ways he didn't want to examine. The wind howled against the windows, and Roman's reflection stared back at him, his expression as inscrutable as the storm-darkened sky. One night, he reminded himself, she would be gone in the morning, and everything would return to normal. But as he stood there in the growing darkness, watching the storm devour the last visible lights of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, however slightly, in his carefully ordered world. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the guest room's plush carpet. Clara had woken before dawn, her body still on the schedule of her former life, where early rising was a necessity, not a choice. She sat cross-legged on the bed, examining the contents of a small sewing kit she'd discovered in one of the bedside drawers. The kit was barely used, typical of luxury hotels and guest rooms, but it contained the basics: needles, scissors, and several spools of thread in standard colors. Clara ran her fingers over the implements with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours with similar tools in hand. As she organized the threads by color, her attention was drawn to a dark wool coat hanging on a nearby chair. She recognized it as the one Roman had worn briefly the night before when checking the terrace doors. Even in her distracted state, she'd noticed the torn cuff, a small but noticeable flaw in his otherwise impeccable appearance. Without really thinking about it, Clara picked up the coat and examined the damage. The silk lining had separated from the wool at the cuff, creating an unsightly gap. It was the kind of repair she'd done hundreds of times before for the elderly residents she helped back home. She settled into a comfortable position by the window, where the morning light was strongest, and began to work. As she stitched, her mind wandered to the innovations she'd developed over years of helping seniors with similar repairs, ways to make clothing more accessible for those with limited mobility or dexterity. On a notepad from the desk, she sketched out an idea that had occurred to her while working on the cuff: a new type of closure system that would allow someone with arthritis to easily manage their own coat buttons. The design was rough but promising. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until Roman's voice broke the silence. "What are you doing with my coat?" Clara startled, nearly dropping her needle. "Mr. Thorne, I'm sorry, I should have asked first. I noticed the torn cuff last night and thought I could help." Roman stepped closer, his expression guarded but curious. He picked up the coat, examining her precise stitching with surprising attention to detail. "This is professional work?" "Thank you," Clara said softly. "I've had a lot of practice. Back home, I volunteer at the senior center, helping with repairs and alterations. Many of them struggle with traditional clothing fasteners, so I've learned to modify things to make them easier to manage." Roman's eyes fell on her sketch. "And this?" "Oh." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "It's just an idea I had while working on the cuff. See, these magnetic closures would be hidden behind decorative buttons, making it easier for someone with limited hand mobility to dress independently. The placement here," she pointed to her drawing, "would maintain the coat's appearance while adding functionality." To her surprise, Roman pulled up a chair and sat down, studying her sketch with intense focus. "You developed this concept just now?" "The basic idea, yes, though I've been working with similar adaptations for years. Each person has different needs: veterans with prosthetics, seniors with arthritis, people recovering from injuries. Their dignity matters just as much as their comfort." Something shifted in Roman's expression, a subtle softening around his eyes. Before he could respond, however, Maribel appeared in the doorway, her usually composed features tight with concern. "Mr. Thorne, I have those quarterly reports you requested." She hesitated, glancing at Clara. "Perhaps we should discuss them in your office." "No need," Roman said, standing. "Miss Monroe was just showing me something interesting." Maribel placed a tablet on the small table, and Clara couldn't help but notice how Roman's posture stiffened as he reviewed the figures. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with unspoken tension. The medical division's numbers are worse than projected, Maribel said quietly. And with the new competition in the tech sector, we're hemorrhaging money. Roman finished flatly. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare display of frustration breaking through his controlled facade. Clara sat quietly, feeling like an intruder in this private moment of crisis. She began gathering her sewing supplies, intending to make herself scarce, when Roman suddenly turned to her. "Your design," he said abruptly. "Could you develop it further? Create a working prototype?" Clara blinked, caught off guard. Yes, with the right materials and time, I could." "And you have experience with this market? The elderly, veterans?" "Yes, several years' worth. I know their needs, their challenges." Roman exchanged a look with Maribel, some silent communication passing between them. "Miss Monroe, I'd like to propose a temporary arrangement. Stay here, develop your prototype. If it's viable, it could be exactly what Thorn Innovations needs, a new direction with real-world applications." Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't face returning to the matchmaking agency yet, not with the humiliation still so fresh. But staying here, in this mansion, with this complicated man? This would be strictly professional? Entirely, Roman confirmed. Maribel can draw up a short-term contract. You'll have access to our development resources and, of course, appropriate compensation. Clara looked down at her sketch, then at the coat with its newly repaired cuff. This wasn't what she'd planned when she'd stepped off that bus yesterday. But maybe it was an opportunity. Not just for her, but to help others in a way she'd never imagined possible. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll stay." "Excellent." Roman's tone was businesslike again. "Maribel will handle the details. Good day, Miss Monroe." He strode out of the room, Maribel following after giving Clara an encouraging smile. Left alone, Clara walked to her small duffel bag and began carefully removing her few possessions, 3 worn dresses, some basic toiletries, and a photo of her parents. As she placed them in the massive walk-in closet, the space seemed to emphasize how little she had, how far she was from the life she'd expected to be living. But as she caught sight of her sketch on the table, a small spark of excitement flickered in her chest. For the first time since arriving at the wrong mansion, she felt a sense of purpose. She might not be where she'd planned to be, but perhaps she was exactly where she needed to be. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Roman led Clara down a series of sleek corridors. Their footsteps echoed against the polished floors, creating a rhythm that matched Clara's quickening heartbeat. She clutched her sketchpad close, trying to contain her nervousness. "This is our design studio," Roman announced, pressing his palm against a biometric scanner. The doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing a space that made Clara's eyes widen in wonder. The room was enormous, easily the size of her entire apartment building's ground floor. Fabric printers lined one wall, their high-tech displays glowing with possibility. Mannequins in various stages of development stood like silent sentinels, some bare, others draped with half-finished prototypes. Scattered throughout the space were abandoned invention models, testament to Roman's restless creativity. "It's incredible," Clara breathed, taking a tentative step forward. Despite her initial overwhelm, she felt a surge of confidence as she spotted a traditional sewing station tucked into one corner. That, at least, was familiar territory. Roman watched her carefully. "Everything you need should be here. The fabric printer can produce any material you specify, and the smart mannequins can adjust to different body types and mobility ranges." Clara nodded, already moving toward the sewing station. She spread her sketches across the pristine workspace, her fingers tracing the lines she'd drawn earlier. "I'd like to start with the magnetic closure system. My grandmother—" She paused, a soft smile touching her lips. She always struggled with buttons because of her arthritis. It broke my heart watching her fight with them every morning. Something shifted in Roman's expression. He moved closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "My father had similar issues," he said quietly. "After his service injury, even simple tasks became challenging." Clara looked up, surprised by this personal revelation. "Was he in the military long?" 20 years. Roman's voice held a hint of pride, tinged with old pain. "Marine Corps. The injury happened during his final tour." "I'm so sorry," Clara said softly. The shared understanding hung in the air between them, creating an unexpected bridge. Hours slipped by as Clara worked, her hands steady and sure as she transformed her ideas into reality. Roman observed from his position near the windows, occasionally offering suggestions about materials or manufacturing processes. Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a peaceful backdrop to their focused work. "The magnets need to be strong enough to hold securely," Clara explained, demonstrating with a prototype sleeve. "But not so strong that they're difficult to separate. It's about finding the right balance." Roman nodded, genuinely impressed by her practical approach. "You've clearly given this a lot of thought." When you spend time with people who struggle with these issues daily, you learn to see the world differently. Clara adjusted a seam, her movements precise. Every button, every zipper becomes an opportunity to help someone maintain their independence. The afternoon light was fading when Roman's stomach growled audibly, making Clara laugh softly. He looked almost embarrassed, an expression she wouldn't have thought possible on his usually composed face. "Perhaps we should take a break," he suggested, checking his watch. "Would you join me for dinner in the dining room?" Clara hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Thank you. That would be nice." The dining room, like everything else in the mansion, was impressive in scale, but somehow sterile, as if rarely used. But as they settled into their seats with steaming plates of pasta, prepared by Roman's kitchen staff, the atmosphere felt surprisingly comfortable. "Tell me about your work with the elderly," Roman said, twirling pasta onto his fork. "How did you start?" Clara took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. "It began with my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She was having trouble dressing herself after a stroke, but couldn't afford special adaptive clothing. I started making simple modifications to her existing clothes, and word spread through the senior center. Before I knew it, I was helping veterans and others with similar needs. But it couldn't have been profitable," Roman observed. "No," Clara admitted with a small smile. "Most of my clients could barely afford the cost of materials. But seeing their faces when they could button their own shirts again or zip their own jackets, that was worth more than money." Roman studied her thoughtfully, struck by her quiet strength. "Your designs could help thousands of people if mass-produced properly." "That would be amazing," Clara said softly, her eyes bright with possibility. "To make that kind of difference." Their conversation flowed naturally as they ate, touching on everything from Clara's childhood dreams of becoming a designer to Roman's early days as an inventor. The formal dining room seemed to grow warmer with each shared story. As they finished their meal, Roman's phone buzzed. He checked the message, his expression neutral. "The roads should be clear by morning." "Oh." Clara felt an unexpected pang in her chest. "That's good news." "Yes," Roman agreed, though his tone lacked conviction. "You'll be able to continue to your intended destination." Clara nodded, pushing back her chair. "Thank you for everything. The workspace, dinner, allowing me to stay. You've been very kind." "It was no trouble," Roman replied automatically, though something in his eyes suggested otherwise. Later, as Clara closed her bedroom door, she leaned against it, her hand lingering on the handle. The thought of leaving tomorrow filled her with a strange melancholy. In just 24 hours, this wrong mansion had started to feel oddly right. She moved to the window, watching snowflakes dance in the security lights below, and wondered if she truly wanted to leave at all. The morning sunlight filtered through the guest room windows, casting a gentle glow across Clara's breakfast tray. Maribel had thoughtfully arranged fresh fruit, yogurt, and warm croissants, along with a steaming cup of herbal tea. Clara ate slowly, savoring each bite while her mind wandered to the prototype designs waiting in Roman's studio. The sharp chime of the doorbell cut through her thoughts. Downstairs, Roman strode toward the entrance, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. Opening the heavy door, he found himself face to face with a man whose weathered appearance contrasted sharply with the mansion's polished interior. "I'm Ben Thorne," the stranger announced, breathing heavily as if he'd been running. His face was red from the cold winter wind, and his work-worn hands clutched a manila envelope. "I'm looking for Clara Monroe." Roman's posture stiffened. "And you are?" "Her intended," Ben replied, pulling documents from the envelope with trembling fingers. "There's been a terrible mix-up. I've been trying to find her for days." "You're the ranch hand," Roman said flatly, examining the paperwork Ben thrust forward. Marriage contract forms, background checks, and correspondence with the matchmaking agency, all bearing Ben's name and Clara's. Their rising voices carried upstairs, where Clara had been finishing her tea. Her heart skipped a beat at the sound of Ben's name. Setting down her cup with shaking hands, she hurried toward the staircase. "I can prove everything," Ben was saying, his earnest voice growing more frustrated. "If you'd just let me speak with her." "Ben," Clara called out softly, appearing at the bottom of the stairs. Both men turned. Ben's face lit up with relief, while Roman's expression became carefully neutral. Clara stood frozen, taking in Ben's appearance, kind eyes, honest face, exactly as his profile had described him. "Clara," Ben breathed. "Thank goodness you're safe. When you didn't arrive at the ranch, I feared the worst." Clara moved closer, her steps hesitant. "I'm so sorry for the confusion. The agency must have mixed up the addresses." "They did," Ben confirmed, running a hand through his wind-tousled hair. "I've been calling them non-stop, trying to figure out what happened. Finally got someone to check their records this morning and found out about the error." Roman watched their interaction with an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. The way Ben looked at Clara, open, hopeful, unguarded, stirred something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. "I came as soon as I got the address," Ben continued, then paused, glancing between Clara and Roman. "But it seems you've been okay here?" Clara nodded, twisting her hands together. "Mr. Thorne, Roman, has been very kind. Actually, I've been helping him with a project." She explained about the adaptive clothing designs, her voice growing animated as she described their progress. Ben listened attentively, but Roman noticed the slight furrow in his brow. "That sounds wonderful," Ben said when she finished. "But Clara, you came here to be a bride, not a designer. The ranch is waiting, and I've got everything prepared for you, just like we discussed in our letters." Clara's expression faltered. I know. It's just... Perhaps," Roman interjected smoothly, surprising himself. Clara could finish the prototype work first. It would only take another day or two. Ben studied Roman for a long moment, then turned back to Clara. "Is that what you want?" Clara caught Roman's eye briefly before nodding. "Yes, please. I'd like to complete what I started. Then, of course. Ben agreed, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I'll find a motel in town and come back tomorrow. We can talk more then? Yes, tomorrow, Clara whispered. Ben reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I'm just glad I found you safe. And thank you, he added, turning to Roman, for taking care of her. Roman managed a stiff nod, fighting the urge to step between them. Ben released Clara's hand and headed back toward his truck, pausing only once to wave before driving away. The entrance hall fell silent. Clara stood rooted in place, her eyes fixed on the closed door. Roman watched, her acutely aware that her presence in his home had somehow become vital to him in ways he wasn't prepared to examine. I should get back to work, Clara said finally, her voice barely audible. Of course, Roman replied, equally quiet. She turned toward the stairs, then stopped. Roman? Yes, thank you, for letting me stay a little longer. He wanted to say more, about her designs, about the way she'd brought life to his sterile home, about the dread he felt at the thought of her leaving. Instead, he simply nodded and watched as she climbed the stairs, each step taking her closer to a decision that would change everything. Clara disappeared into the upper hallway, leaving Roman alone with the realization that he had already lost his careful, emotional distance. The woman who had arrived by mistake, who had turned his ordered world upside down, now held a piece of his heart he hadn't known was still capable of being given. The afternoon sun filtered through the studio's tall windows, casting long shadows across the work tables, where Clara and Roman sat surrounded by fabric samples and design sketches. The silence between them felt heavier now, weighted with unspoken thoughts. Clara smoothed her hand over a piece of soft cotton, focusing on its texture to steady her nerves. I think we can complete the initial prototypes within 3 days, she said quietly. That should give us enough time to perfect the magnetic closures and elastic panels. Roman's fingers stilled on his tablet where he'd been making notes. 3 days, he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. Though his expression remained composed, something flickered in his eyes, a brief shadow of emotion he quickly masked. Yes, Clara confirmed, her throat tight. Once we have working samples, you'll be able to move forward with production testing. She paused, then added softly, and I should keep my commitment to Ben. Roman nodded, his movements precise as he set down his tablet. Of course, the timeline is sensible. He stood and walked to the fabric printer, adjusting settings with unnecessary attention. Clara watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders. Their working relationship had evolved into something unexpectedly natural. The way they anticipated each other's thoughts, how they could communicate complex design adjustments with just a gesture or look. The thought of leaving this creative sanctuary made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. They resumed their work, Roman calling out measurements while Clara adjusted the prototype sleeve design. The familiar rhythm of collaboration gradually eased the awkwardness, though an undercurrent of awareness remained. Each moment now counted down to an ending. Late afternoon sunlight was warming the studio when Clara's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen to see a message from Ben. Checked into the Pinewood Motel. Hope your day is going well. Looking forward to tomorrow. Clara's fingers hovered over the keys, guilt settling in her stomach, though she couldn't quite understand why. After several attempts, she typed back, Glad you're settled. Making good progress here. See you tomorrow. The response felt inadequate, but anything more seemed impossible to express. She looked up to find Roman watching her, his expression unreadable. Ben? He asked, his tone carefully casual. Clara nodded, setting her phone aside. He's found a place to stay in town. Roman turned back to the design table, adjusting a pattern piece with unnecessary precision. Good. That's good. They worked until the sky outside darkened to purple dusk, the studio lights automatically brightening to compensate. As Clara gathered her sketches, Roman cleared his throat. "I'd like to take the prototypes to Riverside Senior Center tomorrow morning," he said. Would you be willing to come along? Your insight during testing would be valuable." Clara looked up, surprised by the request. "The Senior Center? Yes, I've arranged for some residents to try the samples. Their feedback will be essential for refinements." He hesitated. "But I understand if you'd rather not." "No, I'd love to," Clara interrupted, warmth spreading through her chest. "That's exactly the kind of input we need." Roman's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good. We'll leave at 9 o'clock if that suits you." Clara nodded, gathering her materials. "Perfect. I'll be ready." They walked together to the studio door, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. At the base of the stairs, Clara turned to bid him good night, but the words caught in her throat. Roman stood very still, the soft lighting catching the angles of his face, making him look somehow more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "Thank you," she said finally, "for everything." His eyes met hers, intense and searching. "You don't need to thank me. Your work here has been—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Invaluable." Clara nodded, unable to trust her voice, and climbed the stairs to her guest room. Inside, she sank onto the bed, her emotions swirling in confused patterns. Sorrow at the thought of leaving this space where she'd found such unexpected purpose. Tenderness toward the guarded man who had shown her genuine respect for her abilities. Guilt about Ben waiting patiently in his motel room, planning for a future she was no longer certain she wanted. Several floors away, Roman lay in his stark bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The minimalist space that had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed empty, echoing with the absence of warm laughter and the rustle of fabric. His thoughts kept circling back to Clara, her gentle strength, her brilliant mind, the way she'd brought life and purpose back to his work. He turned onto his side, forcing his eyes closed, refusing to name the emotions that kept him awake. 3 more days. Just 3 more days until she would leave with Ben, taking with her something Roman hadn't known he could lose again. The night stretched on, carrying them both toward morning and the decisions that waited there. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the previous day's storm leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow. Clara stood in the mansion's circular driveway, hugging herself against the chill as Roman's sleek, black town car pulled around. Maribel emerged from the front entrance, carrying a large garment bag containing their prototypes. "Merry Christmas!" Maribel called out cheerfully, her breath visible in the crisp air. Roman held the car door open, and Clara slid into the warm leather interior, followed by Maribel. The driver navigated carefully through the snow-lined streets as they made their way toward Riverside Senior Center. "I should warn you," Roman said, breaking the comfortable silence. The center staff weren't exactly thrilled about working on Christmas morning. Clara smiled. But Maribel can be very persuasive." He glanced at his assistant with obvious appreciation. "I simply reminded them that many residents don't have family visiting today." Maribel replied, "A special activity might be exactly what they need." The senior center was a modest brick building with cheerful holiday decorations adorning its windows. As they entered, Clara immediately noticed the warmth of the atmosphere, both in temperature and spirit. A small Christmas tree twinkled in the corner of the lobby, and the sounds of gentle conversation drifted from the common room. Sarah, the activities director, greeted them with surprised enthusiasm. "I didn't expect the famous Roman Thorne himself to come along." She turned to Clara with a welcoming smile. "And you must be the designer. Several of our residents are already waiting in the activity room." The activity room was bright and spacious, with large windows overlooking a snow-covered garden. About 8 seniors sat in comfortable chairs arranged in a loose circle, their faces lighting up with interest as the group entered. Clara stepped forward, her natural warmth immediately putting everyone at ease. "Merry Christmas, everyone. I'm Clara, and we've brought some special garments we'd love your help with." A white-haired woman named Dorothy raised her hand. "What kind of garments, dear?" Clara unzipped the garment bag as she explained. "These are clothes designed specifically for people who might have difficulty with buttons, zippers, or limited range of motion. We'd love your honest feedback." As Clara demonstrated the adaptive features, the seniors leaned forward with increasing interest. She helped Dorothy try on a blouse with magnetic closures cleverly hidden beneath decorative buttons. "Oh my!" Dorothy exclaimed, her fingers running over the smooth closure. "This feels just like a regular blouse, but I can manage it myself without my arthritis acting up." Roman stood back, watching in amazement as Clara moved from person to person. She didn't just help them try on clothes. She listened to their stories, laughed at their jokes, and treated each one with genuine respect and attention. A quiet man in the corner caught Clara's eye. His name tag read James, and she noticed he kept his right hand closed tight against his chest. "Would you like to try something, Mr. James?" she asked gently, kneeling beside his chair. He shook his head. "Had a stroke 2 years ago. Can't manage buttons anymore. My daughter has to help me dress every morning." His voice was gruff with embarrassment. Clara reached into the garment bag and pulled out a dress shirt. "Maybe we could try this one. It has some special features we developed specifically for limited hand mobility." James hesitated, then nodded. Clara helped him slip the shirt on over his t-shirt, demonstrating how the hidden magnetic closures worked. His left hand moved slowly but surely, securing each closure. When the last one was fastened, James sat very still, staring down at his chest, his eyes filled with tears. "I did it myself," he whispered. "First time in 2 years I dressed myself." The room fell quiet. Roman stepped forward, his own throat tight with emotion. "Mr. James, I promise you'll have more shirts like this once we finalize the design. Free of charge." James looked up, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Thank you, both of you." The morning continued with more fittings, adjustments, and conversation. Clara made careful notes about needed improvements, a seam that rubbed uncomfortably here, a closure that needed to be moved slightly there. The seniors offered suggestions and shared stories about their daily challenges with conventional clothing. As lunchtime approached, Roman touched Clara's elbow gently. "There's a cafe around the corner if you'd like to grab something to eat." Clara looked up from where she was noting a final measurement. "That would be wonderful! I'm starving!" They said their goodbyes, promising to return with more prototypes soon. Maribel stayed behind to coordinate future testing dates with the staff. The cafe was small and cozy, decorated with twinkling Christmas lights. They found a quiet corner table, and Clara sank gratefully into her chair. "You were amazing in there," Roman said softly, studying his menu with unusual intensity. Clara blushed. "They're the amazing ones. So much wisdom and grace, even with all their challenges." Their conversation flowed easily over simple sandwiches and hot tea. Roman shared memories of his father struggling with buttons after his injury, and Clara spoke about her grandmother teaching her to sew. She would have loved these adaptive designs, Clara said, wrapping her hands around her warm mug. She always said clothes should work for people, not the other way around. The afternoon light was fading as they returned to the mansion. Clara had just settled into her room when her phone rang. Ben's name lighting up the screen. "Hello," she answered, trying to ignore the sudden tightness in her chest. "Merry Christmas, Clara." Ben's voice was warm and hopeful. "How was your day?" "Merry Christmas," she replied. "It was good. We took the prototypes to the senior center for testing." "That's wonderful. Listen, I was thinking maybe we could have dinner tomorrow. Start getting to know each other properly?" Clara's hand tightened on the phone. "Yes, of course. That would be nice." But even to her own ears, her voice lacked conviction. After saying goodbye, Clara sank onto her bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. The seniors' gratitude, Roman's quiet support, and Ben's patient waiting swirled in her mind. She thought of James's tears of joy, of Roman's gentle smile across the cafe table, of the purpose she'd found in this unexpected place. Her guest room, with its soft evening light and familiar sewing materials spread across the desk, felt more like home than she wanted to admit. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the day settle around her, wondering how something that started as a mistake could feel so right. The morning sun streamed through the studio windows as Clara settled at her workstation. Her fingers moved swiftly, making adjustments to a prototype jacket while steam curled from her tea mug. The mansion felt different today, less intimidating, more like a place where important work happened. Down the hall, Roman's voice echoed from his office. Though she tried not to listen, his tone grew increasingly tense. "These designs aren't just charity," Roman insisted, his voice sharp with frustration. "They're innovative solutions to real problems that no one else is addressing." A pause followed. Then Roman's voice rose again. "No, you're not listening. The market potential." Another pause. "This isn't about sentiment. It's about serving an underserved population while creating sustainable—" The sound of something hitting a desk made Clara jump. "Fine. We'll continue this discussion at the board meeting tomorrow." Roman's words were clipped, controlled, but Clara could hear the anger beneath them. Footsteps approached the studio, and Roman appeared in the doorway. His face was tight with barely contained emotion, his usual composed demeanor cracking at the edges. He paced to the window, running a hand through his dark hair. "The board thinks this is all sentimental nonsense," he said, his voice bitter. "They can't see past their spreadsheets and profit margins." Clara set down her needle and turned to face him. "Tell me what happened." "They want to shut down the adaptive wear project before it begins. Say it's too niche, too risky." He shook his head. "They're worried about stock prices, not people." Clara stood and walked to where Roman stood by the window. "Yesterday at the senior center, did you see their faces? When Mr. James buttoned his own shirt for the first time in 2 years?" Roman's expression softened slightly. "Of course I did." "That moment wasn't about profit margins," Clara continued. "It was about giving someone back their dignity, their independence." She touched his arm gently. "Sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in dollars." Roman turned to look at her, really look at her. "You sound like my father. He always said innovation should serve people first, profits second." "Your father was right." Clara's voice was soft but firm. "And you know what else? People who have been ignored by the market for so long. They remember who finally saw them, who finally helped. That creates loyalty no marketing budget can buy." A small smile tugged at Roman's lips. "Using business logic to appeal to my humanitarian side." Clara grinned. "Whatever works. Now, shall we show those board members what real innovation looks like?" They spent the afternoon in focused collaboration. Clara's hands flew over fabric while Roman refined technical specifications. They tested different closure systems, debated material choices, and sketched improvements. The studio filled with the gentle whir of sewing machines and the scratch of pencils on paper. As evening approached, Clara glanced at her phone and saw a text from Ben. "Looking forward to dinner tonight? I'll pick you up at 7." Reality crashed back in. She had almost forgotten about dinner with Ben. With slightly trembling fingers, she texted back, "See you then." At 7 o'clock sharp, the mansion's doorbell rang. Clara had changed into a simple dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. When she came downstairs, she found Ben and Roman in the foyer, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. "Ready to go?" Ben asked, his smile warm but his eyes uncertain. Clara nodded, gathering her purse. "Yes, thank you." She turned to Roman. "I'll see you tomorrow morning." Roman's face was carefully neutral. "Of course. Have a good evening." The restaurant Ben chose was cozy and informal, with checkered tablecloths and candles in mason jars. He pulled out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy. "I hope you like Italian food," he said, settling across from her. "Yes, it's lovely," Clara replied, though she barely registered the menu in front of her. Ben talked about his ranch, his plans for expanding the horse breeding program, his hopes for the future. Clara tried to focus, to be present, but her mind kept drifting back to the studio, to the breakthrough they'd had with a new closure system, to Roman's passionate defense of their work. "Clara," Ben's voice brought her back to the present. "You seem distant." "I'm sorry," she said quickly. There's so much work still to do with the prototypes." Ben set down his fork. "I understand this project is important to you, but Clara, we need to talk about us, about our future together." Guilt twisted in her stomach. "Of course. You're right. When do you think you'll be finished with the prototypes?" Clara pushed a pasta around her plate. "I'm not sure. There's still so much to perfect." The conversation limped along, full of awkward pauses and forced smiles. When Ben drove her back to the mansion, he seemed subdued. "Good night, Clara," he said softly, touching her hand. I hope we can spend more time together soon." "Good night, Ben. Thank you for dinner." The words felt hollow in her mouth. Inside the mansion, warm light spilled from the studio door. Clara found herself drawn there, still wearing her dinner dress. Roman sat at his desk, surrounded by sketches and fabric samples, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. He looked up as she entered, and their eyes met. A smile passed between them, natural and unrehearsed, carrying more meaning than either intended to convey. "How was dinner?" Roman asked, his voice carefully casual. "Fine," Clara replied, moving to examine the modification he'd made to their latest prototype. "But I see you've solved the wrist closure problem." They fell into easy conversation about design improvements, the earlier tension melting away. Only when the clock struck 11 did Clara reluctantly step back. "I should get some sleep," she said softly. Roman nodded. "Of course. Good night, Clara." She walked to her room slowly, each step heavy with conflicting emotions. Inside, she closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing with feelings she couldn't, or wouldn't, name. Guilt over her distraction during dinner with Ben mingled with an undeniable longing to be back in the studio, working beside Roman, creating something meaningful together. The moon cast silver light through her window, but sleep felt very far away. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with winter sunlight streaming through the mansion's tall windows. Clara woke early, as had become her habit, and made her way to the studio. When she opened the door, she stopped short, her hand flying to her mouth in surprise. In the corner by the window, Where yesterday there had been only storage boxes, now stood a beautiful workspace. A sleek sewing table gleamed in the morning light, complete with a new machine and organized supplies. Beside it, neat shelves held rolls of the exact fabrics she had mentioned wanting to try. Moisture-wicking materials in subtle patterns, specially treated cotton blends, and even some of the innovative stretchy fabrics she'd only read about. "Do you like it?" Roman's voice came from behind her, unusually soft. Clara turned, her eyes bright with emotion. "Roman, I don't know what to say." He shrugged, trying to appear casual, though his eyes watched her reaction intently. "You mentioned needing more space, and these materials will help with the prototypes. It's just practical." But they both knew it was more than that. The care taken in the arrangement, the attention to every detail she had mentioned in passing, it spoke of something deeper than mere practicality. Clara ran her fingers over the smooth wooden surface of the table. "Thank you," she said simply, but her voice carried all the warmth she couldn't express in words. They fell into work naturally, moving around each other with an ease that hadn't been there before. Clara's laughter rang out more frequently now, especially when Roman attempted to thread a needle and failed spectacularly. "Here, let me show you," she said, taking it from his hands. Their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away as quickly as they might have yesterday. From her desk outside the studio, Maribel observed their interactions with knowing eyes. She noticed how Roman's usual stern expression softened when Clara spoke, how Clara's eyes followed him when he moved across the room. The assistant shook her head slightly, a small smile playing on her lips. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Roman's computer chimed with an incoming email. Clara looked up from her work to see his face break into an unexpected grin. "What is it?" she asked, setting aside the prototype she was adjusting. "Harrison Industries," Roman said, his voice animated. "They want to see the adaptive designs in person. Their investment could make this whole line possible." Clara jumped up from her chair, excitement overcoming her usual reserve. Without thinking, she threw her arms around Roman in a spontaneous hug. "That's wonderful!" For a moment, Roman stood frozen. Then his arms slowly came around her. The embrace lasted only seconds before they both stepped back, slightly flustered but smiling. "We should celebrate," Roman said suddenly. Would you join me for dinner tonight, here at the mansion?" Clara nodded, her heart beating a little faster. "I'd like that." Evening found them in the mansion's formal dining room, though Roman had insisted on a smaller table being brought in to make the space less intimidating. Maribel had arranged for a simple but elegant meal to be delivered, and soft lighting from the chandelier cast a warm glow over the room. As they ate, their conversation flowed easily until Clara mentioned Christmas preparations from her childhood. Roman's expression darkened slightly, and he set down his fork. "I haven't celebrated Christmas in 15 years, he said quietly. Clara waited, sensing there was more to come. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than awkward. "My father," Roman started, then paused. "He was a veteran, had trouble with mobility after an injury. I was working on designs to help him, something to make getting dressed easier." His voice grew rough. "But I was too late. On Christmas morning I got the call that he'd fallen. He was alone, couldn't reach his phone." He trailed off, staring into the distance. Clara reached across the table, gently laying her hand over his. "I'm so sorry, Roman." He turned his hand over, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Since then, the holiday just reminds me of failure, of not being there when he needed me." "I understand," Clara said softly. "After my parents died, I lived with my grandmother. She taught me to sew. showed me how to make things that helped people. When arthritis made her hands too stiff to dress herself, I started designing adaptive clothes for her. She passed away last year, but helping others the way I helped her, it makes me feel close to her still." They sat in companionable silence, hands still joined across the table, each lost in memories, but somehow less alone in sharing them. Later, as they walked up the grand staircase toward their rooms, their steps slowed. They paused at the top, neither quite ready for the evening to end. "Thank you for dinner," Clara said softly, "and for sharing about your father." "Thank you for listening," Roman replied, his voice equally quiet. They stood there longer than necessary, the mansion around them feeling warmer and more alive than it had in years. Finally, with reluctant smiles, they turned toward their separate rooms, each carrying the weight of words left unspoken but felt deeply in their hearts. The hallway lights dimmed automatically as they disappeared behind their doors, but the warmth of their connection lingered in the air, filling the usually austere mansion with an almost tangible sense of possibility. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Thorne Innovations conference room, catching the subtle sparkle in Clara's newly pressed blazer, a gift from Maribel to help her look professional for the presentation. She stood beside Roman at the front of the room, her hands steady despite her nerves as she demonstrated the adaptive closures on their flagship prototype. "As you can see," Clara explained to the assembled board members and the distinguished representative from Harrison Industries, "these modified fastenings allow complete independence for those with limited mobility." Her voice carried confidence born from passion as she showed how easily the garment could be secured with minimal hand strength. Roman watched her with pride, noting how the board members leaned forward in their chairs, clearly impressed. Even Mr. Harrison, known for his stoic demeanor, nodded appreciatively as Clara detailed the market research showing demand for adaptive clothing. "The potential reach is significant," Roman added, stepping forward to share the financial projections. "We estimate serving over 100,000 customers in the first year alone." The presentation continued smoothly, with Clara and Roman tag-teaming responses to questions. Their natural chemistry was evident in how they anticipated each other's thoughts, building on one another's points seamlessly. The energy in the room felt electric with possibility. Just as Mr. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, a commotion erupted from the lobby outside. Through the glass walls, they could see Ben Thorne, his face flushed and his ranch clothes out of place among the suits and ties of corporate headquarters. "Clara!" Ben's voice carried through the doors. "Clara, what's going on? I saw the rumors online." Clara's heart dropped to her stomach. Roman tensed beside her as Ben pushed his way into the conference room, followed by a woman with a phone held high, recording everything. "Sir, you can't be in here," a security guard called, hurrying after them. "Is it true?" Ben demanded, his eyes wild with hurt. "Are you and him—" He gestured at Roman, unable to finish the sentence. The woman with the phone pressed closer. "This is Jessica Chen from City Beat News. Can you comment on your relationship with Mr. Thorne?" Clara stood frozen, her carefully constructed professional persona crumbling as her two worlds collided catastrophically. The board members whispered among themselves, while Mr. Harrison's expression darkened with concern. "Ben, please," Clara managed to say. "This isn't the place. She was supposed to be my bride." Ben burst out, his voice cracking with emotion. "We had a contract through the matchmaking agency. She was meant to come to my farm, not his mansion." Jessica Chen's eyes lit up with predatory excitement. "A mail-order bride situation, with both Thorns involved? This is incredible!" "That's enough," Roman commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Security, clear the room." But the damage was done. Jessica Chen was already backing out, thumbs flying over her phone as she composed her story. The board members gathered their things hastily, murmuring about public relations nightmares and stock prices. Mr. Harrison shook his head apologetically at Roman before following them out. "Ben?" Clara said softly, approaching him as security arrived. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "I waited for you," Ben replied, his anger deflating into sadness. "I thought we could have something real." As security led Ben away, Clara turned to find Roman standing rigid by the conference table, his face a mask of controlled emotion. The warmth of the previous evening had vanished completely. "Roman," she started, but he held up a hand. "Don't," he said flatly. "This is my fault. I should have sent you to Ben that first night. Instead, I let myself—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "I'll have Maribel arrange transportation wherever you need to go. Please, just let me explain. It's better this way." Roman cut her off, his voice distant and professional once more. "The board was right. I let sentiment cloud my judgment." Clara's phone buzzed incessantly as notifications poured in. The story was spreading like wildfire. Headlines flashed across her screen. "Billionaire's secret love triangle with mail-order bride," and "Gold digger plays both thorns." Tears burning in her eyes, Clara fled the conference room. In the elevator, she pulled up more headlines, each one worse than the last. Social media was exploding with cruel speculation about her character, her motives, her relationship with both men. Back in her guest room, Clara moved on autopilot, packing her few belongings into her small duffel bag. Her fingers brushed against the sketches she'd made with Roman, dreams of helping others now tainted by scandal. She left them on the desk. The mansion felt colder than ever as she made her way down the grand staircase one last time. Through the windows, she could see snowflakes beginning to fall, just as they had when she'd arrived, though that hopeful young woman felt like a stranger now. Clara paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. Behind her, the mansion stood silent, its warmth of the previous evening erased by the morning's chaos. Ahead lay uncertainty, but she knew she had to go. She was hurting everyone by staying: Roman, whose reputation and business were now at risk; Ben, whose trust she had inadvertently betrayed; and herself, falling for a man who could never be hers. With a deep breath, Clara stepped out into the swirling snow, leaving behind the dreams, prototypes, and unspoken feelings that had bloomed in this brief, beautiful interlude. The heavy door clicked shut behind her with a sound of finality, and the snowflakes quickly began to dust her shoulders as she walked away from the mansion. Clara's hands trembled as she unlocked the door to her tiny apartment. The key stuck in the worn lock, just as it always had, but tonight the familiar struggle felt overwhelming. Inside, darkness greeted her. She hadn't been here to pay the electric bill. At least the landlord hadn't cut off the power completely. She dropped her duffel bag by the door and fumbled for the light switch. A single bare bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the cramped space. Her fold-out couch still wore the same faded blanket, and the kitchenette counter held the same chipped mug she'd left behind. Everything was exactly as she had left it, yet nothing felt the same. Sinking onto the couch, Clara pulled out her phone. She knew she shouldn't look, but her fingers moved on their own, opening news site after news site. Each headline felt like a fresh wound. Thorn Innovations scandal, mail-order mix-up, or gold diggers game. Billion-dollar love triangle, rural ranch hand versus tech titan. Adaptive clothing line or adaptive gold digger. Comment sections overflowed with cruel speculation. Strangers who had never met her confidently declared her motives, her character, her worth. Some defended her, but their kind words were drowning in a sea of judgment. I bet she planned it all along. One comment read, "What better way to trade up from a ranch hand to a billionaire?" Clara's vision blurred with tears. She had only wanted to help people, to bring dignity to those who struggled with everyday tasks. Now she had not only failed at that, but had also destroyed Roman's chance to save his company. The board's faces flashed in her memory, their disapproval clear as they hurried from the conference room. Sleep proved impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Roman's face. The way he had shut down, his warm brown eyes turning to ice. Or Ben's expression of betrayal. His hurt shouted across the lobby for everyone to hear. She tossed and turned on the lumpy fold-out, the springs creaking in protest. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Clara gave up on sleep. She retrieved her salvaged sketches from the duffel bag, spreading them across the tiny coffee table. Here was the first design she'd shown Roman, the coat with its innovative closures. There were the prototypes they'd refined together, each one carefully annotated in both their handwriting. His elegant script next to her, rushed notes told the story of their collaboration, of long hours spent working side by side. Dawn crept in through the apartment's single window, painting the sketches in pale light. Clara's stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since before the disastrous presentation. She changed into fresh clothes, simple jeans and a sweater that felt strange after the professional outfits she'd worn at the mansion, and headed to the cafes down the street. The Bell and Brew was usually quiet this early, which was exactly what Clara needed. She ordered a simple coffee and found a corner table, hoping to gather her thoughts in peace. But peace wasn't in the cards. "Did you see the news about Thorne Innovations?" A woman's voice carried from the counter. "That gold digger story." Clara's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Oh my God, yes!" Her friend replied. "Can you believe someone would do that? Playing both cousins against each other?" "I heard she was living in his mansion the whole time, probably planning how to get her hands on his money." Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Several heads turned her way, and she thought she saw recognition dawn in one woman's eyes. Grabbing her barely touched coffee, Clara hurried out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully in contrast to her turmoil. Back at the mansion, Roman stood in the doorway of his design studio. The room felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too empty. No sound of scissors snipping through fabric, no soft humming as Clara worked, no gentle voice asking his opinion on a new design feature. He stepped inside, running his hand along the workspace he'd cleared for her. Just yesterday, he'd watched her face light up at the sight of the new fabrics he'd ordered. Now those same fabrics lay abandoned, their potential unrealized. Something caught his eye on the far table, a notebook he didn't recognize. He picked it up, immediately identifying Clara's neat handwriting. It was filled with more than just designs. There were dreams spelled out in bulleted lists. Adaptive wear affordable for everyone. Partner with veterans organizations. Mobile fitting service for homebound seniors. Between the pages, he found something that made his breath catch. Handwritten notes from the seniors at the center. "Dear Clara," one read in shaky handwriting, "Thank you for giving me back my independence. For the first time in years, I dressed myself without help. God bless you." Another said simply, "You saw us as people, not problems. Thank you." Roman sank into Clara's chair, still holding the notebook. The silence of the studio pressed in around him, broken only by the sound of his uneven breathing. He had spent years building walls around himself, focusing on profits and progress, telling himself that was enough. Then Clara had arrived, bringing warmth and purpose back into his life. He missed her. Not the designs, though they were brilliant. Not the business opportunity, though it could have saved his company. He missed her presence, her gentle strength, her way of seeing the person behind every problem. The studio felt hollow without her, like all the innovation and creativity had walked out the door with her. Running his fingers over the notes from the seniors, Roman felt shame wash over him. He had let fear of scandal and the board's disapproval override what he knew in his heart, that Clara was the most genuine person he'd ever met. She hadn't been after his money or his name. She had simply wanted to help people, and he had let her take the fall for his own cowardice. Roman sat there in the silent studio, gripping Clara's notebook like a lifeline, knowing with crushing certainty that he had to make this right. The how of it eluded him, but the truth was crystal clear. He had lost something far more precious than a business deal when he let Clara walk away. The morning sun streamed through Roman's office windows, but he barely noticed it. His fingers flew across the keyboard, composing an email to the senior center's director. He hadn't slept much, Clara's notebook still sitting on his desk where he'd left it the night before. I will personally fund the delivery of all adaptive clothing pieces promised during our Christmas Day visit, he wrote, then paused. It felt too formal, too corporate. He deleted the line and started again. The seniors I met on Christmas Day showed me what really matters. I want to honor the promise Clara made to help them. Please let me know how many pieces you need, and I'll cover the entire cost. Roman hit send, then leaned back in his chair. Maribel appeared in the doorway, holding her tablet. The board is requesting an emergency meeting, she said softly. Tell them I'm handling something more important right now. His voice was firm. The phone rang almost immediately after his email. It was Sarah, the senior center's activities director. Her voice trembled with emotion. Mr. Thorne, I can't tell you what this means to us. After yesterday's horrible news stories, we were worried. She paused. The seniors haven't stopped talking about Clara since Christmas Day. Mr. Jenkins, the veteran who cried when he could button his own shirt. He told everyone at breakfast that she was the first person in years to treat him like a capable human being instead of an invalid. Roman's throat tightened. Tell me more about that day, he said quietly. Oh, there are so many stories. Mrs. Rodriguez showed me how she can now put on her cardigan without help from her daughter. She said Clara spent 20 minutes adjusting the closures until they were perfect for her arthritic hands. Sarah's voice grew warmer with each memory. And Clara knew all their names by the end of the visit. She really listened to them, you know? They weren't just test subjects to her. After hanging up, Roman pulled up the tabloid's website. The inflammatory headline about Clara still blazed across the top. Gold digger breeds drama between billionaire cousins. His jaw clenched as he dialed his lawyer's direct line. James, I need you to draft a cease and desist letter. Actually, make that a lawsuit threat. Roman's voice was steel. They either print a full retraction and correction, or we take them apart piece by piece. The board won't like this, James cautioned. The board doesn't have to like it. This isn't about business, it's about doing what's right. While James worked on the legal documents, Roman drove to the senior center. He needed to see firsthand the impact Clara had made. The front desk staff recognized him immediately, and several seniors approached him with warm smiles. Mr. Jenkins, the veteran, wheeled over to show Roman his adaptive shirt. Look here. He demonstrated proudly. I can do all the buttons myself now. Your young lady thought of everything. She's not. Roman started to correct him, then stopped. The words felt hollow. Back at the mansion that afternoon, Roman organized the delivery of the first batch of adaptive clothing. He included a personal note with each piece, explaining that this was fulfilling Clara's promise. Then he sat down with Clara's notebook again, really studying her early sketches. They weren't just designs. They were solutions to real problems. Each page showed her deep understanding of what people needed to feel dignified and independent. Meanwhile, across town, Clara sat cross-legged on her apartment floor, surrounded by envelopes. A delivery person had just dropped off a large package filled with letters from the senior center. Her hands shook as she opened the first one. "Dear Clara," wrote Mrs. Rodriguez in careful script. "Today I made breakfast by myself because I could dress without waiting for my daughter's help. I felt like me again, not just someone's burden. Thank you for seeing what we needed." Tears splashed onto the paper as Clara read letter after letter. Mr. Jenkins had written about showing his grandchildren how he could button his own shirt. Another resident described feeling human again after years of struggling with traditional clothing. "You gave us more than clothes," one letter read. "You gave us back our dignity." Clara pressed the letters to her chest, her shoulders shaking with sobs. All her life she'd wanted to make a difference, to help people who were often overlooked. Despite the scandal and the cruel headlines, these letters proved her work mattered. It had changed lives. Back at Thorne Innovations, Roman sat in his design studio as evening approached. Clara's sketches were spread across his desk, early morning light catching silver hair as she adjusted a sleeve, the quiet determination in her eyes as she worked, the gentle way she'd explained her ideas. He realized with stunning clarity that he didn't just miss her designs or her innovative thinking. He missed her warmth, her compassion, the way she made every room feel more alive. The future he saw for his company now was different from anything he'd imagined before. It wasn't about profit margins or board approval. It was about using their resources and reach to help people, to restore dignity to those who needed it most. But more than that, he couldn't imagine that future without Clara in it. Roman stood abruptly, grabbing his coat from the back of his chair. The mansion felt too empty, too quiet without her presence. He knew now what he needed to do, where he needed to go. As he strode toward the door, Maribel appeared with another stack of urgent messages from the board. "Not now," he said firmly, shrugging on his coat. "There's something more important I need to handle first." The sun was setting as Roman left the mansion, casting long shadows across the snow-covered grounds. But for the first time in years, his steps were sure, his purpose clear. The time for hiding behind corporate walls and careful distance was over. The winter sun had barely crested the horizon when Roman's luxury car pulled into the modest motel parking lot. His polished shoes crunched on salt-covered asphalt as he made his way to room 112, where Ben Thorne was staying. Roman's hand hesitated for a moment before knocking firmly on the worn door. Inside, Ben had been sitting on the edge of his bed, head in his hands. The past few days had been a blur of regret and sleepless nights. When he heard the knock, he straightened his flannel shirt and opened the door, surprise registering on his weathered face. "Roman," Ben said quietly, stepping back to let his cousin enter. "I've been hoping to talk to you." The motel room was small but neat, with Ben's duffel bag still mostly packed in the corner. The morning news played silently on the old television, showing yet another gossip segment about the scandal. Ben quickly switched it off. "I'm so sorry," Ben began, his voice thick with shame. "I never meant for any of this to happen. When I heard those rumors about Clara being with you, I lost my head. I should have handled it better." Roman stood by the window, his shoulders tense but his expression softening. "We both made mistakes," he admitted. "I kept telling myself Clara was just here temporarily, that she'd leave once the designs were done. But I think I knew, even that first night, that she was special." Ben nodded slowly, sinking into the room's only chair. "I saw it too, you know. At dinner that night, the way she kept talking about the project, about you. She lights up when she discusses those designs. She lights up when she talks about helping people." Roman corrected gently. That's who she is. And He paused, running a hand through his usually perfectly styled hair. I should never have made her feel like she was just a temporary disruption in my life. She deserves better than that. The cousins fell silent for a moment, the hum of the motel's heating system filling the quiet. Outside, early morning traffic was picking up on the nearby highway. She deserves the truth, Ben said finally. From both of us, and she deserves to make her own choice without pressure or obligations. Roman turned from the window to face his cousin. Would you be willing to come with me to see her? I think she needs to hear from both of us. Ben stood, determination replacing the guilt on his face. Yes, it's the right thing to do. Let me grab my coat. Meanwhile, across town in her tiny apartment, Clara sat at her second-hand sewing machine. The familiar whir of the needle usually brought her comfort, but today her hands trembled as she guided the fabric. She was working on simple garments, nothing like the innovative designs she'd created at Thorn Innovations, but even these basic pieces kept coming out crooked. Sunlight filtered through her single window, catching dust motes in its beam. Clara had been up since dawn, unable to sleep, trying to lose herself in work. But every few minutes her eyes would drift to the pile of letters from the senior center and her heart would ache anew. The clock on her wall ticked past 2 o'clock when she heard a knock at her door. Clara sighed, assuming it was her landlord making his weekly rounds. She quickly wiped her eyes, not wanting him to see she'd been crying. Just a moment, she called out, smoothing her simple dress and checking her reflection in the small mirror by the door. But when she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. There in her narrow hallway stood Roman and Ben, both looking somewhat uncomfortable but determined. Roman wore one of his impeccable suits, though his tie was slightly loosened, a small detail that spoke volumes about his state of mind. Ben had on clean jeans and a pressed shirt, his usual ranch wear upgraded for the occasion. Clara, Roman said softly, his eyes taking in her surprised expression. May we come in? She stepped back automatically, opening the door wider. Her apartment suddenly felt impossibly small with these 2 tall men inside it. The contrast between her humble space and Roman's mansion couldn't have been more stark. Her second-hand furniture, the carefully patched curtains, the tiny kitchenette where she made her meals. Ben closed the door gently behind them, and for a moment all 3 stood in awkward silence. Clara's sewing machine whirred to a stop on its own, the last stitch hanging incomplete. Would you? Clara's voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again. Would you like to sit down? I don't have many chairs, but... Clara. Roman interrupted gently, his voice tender and nervous in a way she'd never heard before. Could we all sit and talk? There are some things we need to say. She nodded slowly, gesturing to her small sitting area. The afternoon sun streamed through her window, casting long shadows across the floor as the 3 of them moved toward the most important conversation of their lives. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and the weight of decisions yet to be made. Clara's hands twisted in her lap as she waited for someone to begin. Inside Clara's modest apartment, the tension was thick enough to touch. Sunlight streamed through the patched curtains, casting gentle shadows across the worn carpet as Ben took a deep breath and stepped forward. Clara, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I need to apologize. What happened with that reporter? It was my fault. I let my feelings get the better of me, and I wasn't thinking clearly. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. You don't owe me anything. Not a contract, not a marriage, not even an explanation. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she listened. Ben, He held up his hand gently. Please, let me finish. You're an amazing woman, Clara. Anyone can see that. And I think... He glanced briefly at Roman before continuing. I think sometimes life has a way of putting us exactly where we're meant to be, even if it's not where we thought we were heading. The room fell quiet for a moment, save for the distant sound of traffic outside. Ben straightened his shoulders and offered a small, sincere smile. I'm going to head out now. You two have some things to discuss, and you don't need an audience for that. Before either could respond, he turned and walked to the door, pausing only briefly with his hand on the knob. I truly hope you find your happiness, Clara. With that, he slipped out, leaving Roman and Clara alone in the tiny apartment. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Roman stood near the window, his usual confident posture slightly uncertain. Clara perched on the edge of her threadbare couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, Roman turned to face her fully. Clara, he said softly, his voice carrying a vulnerability she'd never heard before. I've spent the last few days trying to figure out how to fix everything, the company, the scandal, all of it. But I realized something important. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. None of that matters as much as fixing what I broke between us. Clara's breath caught in her throat as Roman moved to sit beside her on the couch. The truth is, I've been lonely for so long, I forgot what it felt like not to be. I built walls around myself after my father died, convinced myself that focusing only on the company was enough. He smiled sadly. Then you showed up at my door in the middle of a snowstorm, and everything changed. Roman, Clara whispered, but he gently shook his head. Please, let me get this out. He took a deep breath. I've been afraid of love, afraid of letting anyone close enough to matter. But watching you with those seniors, seeing your compassion, your courage, your incredible heart, it woke something in me I thought was long dead. Tears rolled freely down Clara's cheeks now as Roman continued. You didn't just change the company's future with your designs, Clara. You changed my heart. And I don't want you as a designer or an employee or a temporary guest in my life. He reached out slowly, taking her trembling hands in his. I want you as the woman I choose to spend my life with, if you'll have me. Clara's shoulders shook with emotion as she finally spoke. I felt it too, she admitted softly. Every moment we spent together in that studio, every conversation, every shared smile, but I couldn't let myself believe it. I'm just a seamstress from a small town, and you're... She gestured helplessly. I'm just a man who finally found what he was missing. Roman finished for her, reaching up to gently wipe away her tears. You are so much more than you give yourself credit for, Clara. Your worth isn't measured in dollars or social status. It's in the way you light up a room, the way you see possibilities where others see problems, the way you make everyone around you feel valued and heard. Clara leaned into his touch, her heart thundering in her chest. I was so afraid, she whispered, afraid of wanting something I didn't think I could have. I'm right here, Roman said softly, drawing her closer. No contracts, no confusion. Just us, choosing each other. Their embrace was gentle, filled with all the tender feelings they'd held back for so long. Clara buried her face in Roman's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, feeling truly at home for the first time since she'd left the mansion. When they finally pulled apart, Roman's eyes were bright with hope. The senior center called yesterday, he said. They've been asking about you, about the adaptive clothing line. Would you consider coming with me later this week to restart the project, this time as true partners? Clara's smile could have lit up the darkest night. Yes, she answered without hesitation. Yes to all of it. Their hands remained intertwined as afternoon sun painted golden stripes across the apartment floor, their hearts finally beating in sync. No longer alone, no longer afraid. The late December sun cast long shadows across the mansion's marble floors as Clara wheeled her small suitcase through the familiar halls. This time, though, everything felt different. No uncertainty clouded her steps, no confusion about her place here. "Welcome home," Roman said softly, taking her bag from her. His hand brushed, hers sending warmth through her entire body. Maribel waited at the top of the stairs, beaming. "Your office is ready, Ms. Monroe," she said, leading them down the hall. "Or should I say, Creative Director Monroe?" Clara's breath caught as they entered what had been the spare design studio. The space had been transformed. Clean white walls now displayed her original sketches in elegant frames. Gleaming work tables held state-of-the-art sewing machines, and expansive windows let in natural light perfect for detailed work. "Roman," she whispered, "this is too much." He shook his head. "This is exactly what you deserve." He guided her to a polished desk where a new nameplate read, "Clara Grace Designs, Creative Director." "Your vision deserves to be front and center. I was just the lucky one who recognized it." Over the next few days, Clara threw herself into rebuilding the adaptive clothing line. With Roman's public statement clearing her name and Ben's heartfelt apology video going viral, investors began calling again. But this time, things were different. "No," Roman said firmly during one video call, his hand resting supportively on Clara's shoulder. "The brand will be called Clara Grace Designs. She's not just a consultant, she's the creative force behind everything we're doing here." Clara looked up at him gratefully, still amazed by how fiercely he championed her vision. Together, they worked late into the evenings, refining designs and planning the New Year's Eve fundraising ball, where they would officially launch the line. The senior center called again. Maribel announced one morning, smiling. "They're thrilled about being guests of honor at the ball. Mrs. Henderson says she's already picked out her outfit." Clara laughed, remembering the spirited octogenarian who had been one of their first prototype testers. "I bet she has. Did she mention which color she chose?" The days flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. Clara insisted on personally overseeing every detail of the adaptive formal wear being created for their senior guests. Roman watched in admiration as she worked tirelessly, her gentle hands making sure each garment would allow its wearer to dress independently while feeling elegant. Finally, New Year's Eve arrived. The grand ballroom of the city's finest hotel sparkled with thousands of tiny lights. Clara stood nervously backstage, smoothing down her midnight blue gown, one she had designed herself, with the same innovative closures used in their adaptive line. "You look beautiful," Roman's voice came from behind her. He was handsome in his tuxedo, but what struck her most was the warmth in his eyes. Gone was the cold, distant man who had first opened his door to her on that snowy night. The ball began with a touching parade of their senior guests, each one walking or wheeling proudly in their Clara Grace designs. Mrs. Henderson beamed in a deep purple ensemble that she had buttoned herself for the first time in years. Mr. Garcia, the veteran whose emotional response had first shown them the true impact of their work, wore a perfectly fitted tuxedo with magnetic closures. When it was time for Roman's speech, Clara held her breath. He stood at the podium, commanding the room's attention, but his voice was unusually soft. "A month ago I had forgotten what Christmas meant," he began. "I had forgotten what it meant to see beyond profit margins and stock prices. Then fate, and a mix-up with my cousin," he added with a smile, drawing knowing laughter from the crowd, "brought Clara Monroe to my door." He turned to face her, his eyes shining. "She reminded me that true innovation isn't about technology or efficiency. It's about restoring dignity to people's lives. about seeing the human needs behind every problem we try to solve. Clara didn't just create a clothing line, she created a movement to give independence back to those who thought they'd lost it forever. Clara felt tears welling up as Roman continued. She restored my faith in compassion, in Christmas, and in the power of leading with your heart. Every person in this room wearing our adaptive designs tonight is proof that one person's kindness can transform countless lives. As midnight approached, Roman found Clara among the dancers and led her towards the balcony. The city stretched out below them, a canvas of twinkling lights under the winter sky. Music from the ballroom drifted out softly, mixing with the distant sounds of New Year's celebrations. "Clara," Roman said quietly, taking both her hands in his. "I've been thinking about resolutions for the new year." She smiled up at him. "And what have you decided?" "Just one," he said, his voice tender. "I want my first resolution, my most important promise, to be building a future with you." He reached into his pocket and dropped to one knee, producing a ring that sparkled like starlight. "Clara Monroe, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Clara's heart soared as tears of joy spilled down her cheeks. Inside, the countdown to midnight began, but she didn't need to wait to know her answer. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes!" Roman slipped the ring onto her finger just as fireworks burst across the sky, painting the night in brilliant colors. He stood and drew her close, kissing her with all the love that had grown between them since that first snowy night. As they broke apart, Clara looked up at Roman with shining eyes. "I love you," she said simply. "And I love you," he replied, holding her close as the new year dawned around them. "Thank you for teaching me how to love again." They stood together on the balcony, watching the fireworks paint the sky, their hearts beating as one. What had begun as a mistake, a wrong address on a snowy Christmas Eve, had bloomed into something beautiful and true. As the first minutes of the new year ticked by, Clara and Roman held each other close, knowing that their greatest adventure was just beginning. The senior center buzzed with joyful anticipation on a crisp mid-January morning. Volunteers had transformed the community room into an intimate wedding chapel, with handmade quilts draped along the walls in warm patterns of burgundy and cream. Small clusters of white candles flickered among mason jars filled with winter flowers, their soft glow reflecting off the freshly polished floors. Mrs. Henderson directed the final touches from her wheelchair, making sure each handcrafted decoration was perfectly placed. "Everything must be just right for our Clara," she insisted, smoothing a quilt she had stitched herself. In a small side room, Clara stood before a mirror, touching the delicate closure she had designed into her wedding gown. The dress was elegantly simple, ivory silk that flowed like water, with innovative fasteners hidden beneath traditional pearl buttons. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the neckline. "You look absolutely beautiful, dear," said Mr. Garcia, the veteran who had first shown them the impact of their work. He had asked for the honor of walking her down the aisle, and Clara had tearfully accepted. In the main room, Roman waited at the makeshift altar, his usual corporate armor replaced by a gentle vulnerability that showed in his soft smile and bright eyes. When the music began, played on the center's old piano by one of the residents, he stood straighter, his heart racing. Clara appeared in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on Mr. Garcia's arm. Tears welled up in the eyes of the seniors as she passed them, each one remembering how she had touched their lives with her kindness and creativity. Roman watched her approach, overwhelmed by how far they had come from that snowy night when she first appeared at his door. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, spoken in voices that carried clearly through the hushed room. After exchanging rings, Roman surprised everyone by announcing their new nationwide program: free adaptive wear for low-income seniors and veterans. The room erupted in applause and happy tears. During the modest reception that followed, Roman pulled Clara close as they swayed to their first dance. "You know," he whispered in her ear, "the day you showed up in those threadbare clothes was actually the richest day of my life." Clara's eyes shimmered with joy as she looked up at him. Who would have thought a wrong address could lead to so much right? As the celebration wound down, they prepared to leave. Their guests lined up to shower them with rose petals as they made their way to the waiting car. Snowflakes began to fall gently from the winter sky, just like the night their paths first crossed. Roman helped Clara into the car, then joined her, taking her hand in his. Through the back window they could see their beloved senior center family waving goodbye, and as they drove away, the soft snow continued to fall, a reminder of how their story began. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.